Hello, everyone. This is the MSC Performance Podcast. My name is Kitti, and today I've got a very special guest with me. One of our members, Avital, kindly agreed to join me in this episode where we will be talking about the menstrual cycle. Hello, Avital.
Hi.
So Avita is currently doing a PhD researching the menstrual cycle and its effects on exercise performance. And she's also teaching at a university, assisting on
all the sports courses.
Basically, yeah. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Excited. I finally get to speak about the menstrual cycle for a reason, not just force on people.
Good. Okay,
yeah,
awesome.
I'm excited.
Yeah, that's good. So starting out, what I wanted to talk about first is just what is the menstrual cycle? Like, what are the different phases of it? What is a regular menstrual cycle? How long does it last? Things like that. So if you just want to give us a brief overview.
Yeah, I have my handy chart here, which obviously is a bit redundant on the podcast, but it's being filmed. So if you're watching this on YouTube or whilst you're listening, go onto YouTube and then you can see it. So the menstrual cycle is one of the, the predominant component of the female reproductive system. And there are two main hormones associated with it, which you may be familiar with, estrogen and progesterone.
Yeah.
So we briefly talk about the phases. So for the purpose of the YouTube, I'll
it's fine.
YouTube, hold that up. So we start off in the initial phase, which is also called the follicular phase. And estrogen and progesterone are pretty low for all of that, and that typically lasts for about 14 days. So when we're talking about how long it lasts as well, the textbook cycle is 28 days. In reality, a normal menstrual cycle is going to be anywhere from about 23 to 35 days. So there's a lot of variation, but you just get about the 28 textbook length a lot. And then the second phase is the when ovulation occurs, the ovulatory phase. People call it different things. That's typically around day 14 and lasts for about 16 to 36 hours. So it's a pretty short period. And in the ovulatory phase, that's when estrogen peaks. And then after that, we go into the luteal phase, which again, about 14 days. And in this phase, estrogen will dip a bit, but still remains high. And then progesterone, that's when it peaks. And then towards the end of the luteal phase, it'll start to dip again. And also, I think it's important to note for those who can't see my handy little chart,
which is perfectly made. Like,
thank you. It's color coded as well.
It's
that the hormones don't just drastically increase and decrease. Like when I say in the luteal phase, towards the end, it drops off. It's not like it suddenly dips. It'll sort of flow. So that's probably the briefest way to explain it.
I think it's difficult because there's an importance of in-between phases fluctuations as well. So it's not so black and white, whereas this is one phase, this is the other one, and that's it. It's like
exactly
so much variation, and it's very individual as well.
Yeah, so much variation. There's variation between females. From even just one individual, there'll be variation throughout their own life as well, what occurs. And then we've obviously got the different hormone profiles in sort of different phases. Then there's also things to consider, like just the fact that the hormone has increased, is that going to have an impact on an individual, whether that's a physical, psychological impact. There's just so many different things to be aware of. Another one to note as well is that often when progesterone and estrogen are both high, that often the positive impacts of estrogen are somewhat negated by the effects of progesterone, and we just don't know enough. And we were saying at the beginning, we're going to try and not just have the themes throughout this podcast. We don't know enough. It's just individual. We don't know. But also it kind of is that,
literally guys, I'm so sorry. Like the whole podcast for 45 minutes you're going to listen to this, and the whole
don't know.
Just skip the whole thing. Basically we don't know, and it's individual. That's it.
Pretty much.
But if we want to go into why does this matter, what is the effect of these hormone fluctuations on exercise performance, where is the research? Like, what is happening at the moment? What are you finding throughout your own research? Where are we at this point?
Great question. So I thought I'd just talk you through from like previous research and sort of where we're at now. And also just say the prior thing, because I didn't actually say this, but I reckon most people know that like the first sort of 3, 5, 7 days of the follicular phase will be menstruation itself.
Yeah.
And menstruation is not interchangeable with the menstrual cycle. Often when you, and I'm gonna say here, often more males will hear menstruation and then to them that's the whole menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is all the phases put together. So just while we're talking about that, just important to note. Yeah, so previous research, females are researched a lot less than males. I don't think we should go into the whole like historical social
like
another podcast.
We'll save that for another day.
Lots of thoughts. But yeah, just historically they're not really researched because they are a lot harder to research because of the hormonal profiles.
So much variation.
But they still account for 50% of the population. More recently also, because in sport, again, historically, they didn't account for 50% of the sporting population, again, because of various reasons that we won't get into, sexism, but anyway.
You have to drop it in there.
So there's just limited research. So we don't know for definite how various variables may influence females differently as opposed to males. And again, they might not take protein dose, for instance. I think there's been a recent-ish study which looked at protein dose and like muscle growth in females.
Okay.
And there's not actually necessarily a difference from like the recommendation for what you'd say to the general population. But we also just don't know. And then within that, just females in general not being researched. We have the specifics of the female athlete because females are not just smaller males. They have a different physiological profile.
100%.
And again, like we said, it's not necessarily that there's going to be differences, but there might be, and we just don't know. So that's why it's important to do the research. So in the past couple of decades, there has definitely been research that's been done. There's a few issues with that research. A lot of it's low quality. Something that is gone.
So sorry to cut you off. What do you mean by low quality? What does that mean?
So when it comes to research, it's really important that the testing that you're doing is valid. So what you're trying to measure, are you actually measuring that? Is it reliable as well? Is it repeatable? What's really hard when it comes to menstrual cycle research is you need to know, even I just went through sort of a textbook 28-day cycle, but we do not know for definite just from looking at someone what phase of the cycle they're in. It's pretty easy to say, right, they're in the follicular phase, early follicular phase, because when you start menstruating, it's easy to say that. When it comes to ovulation, yes, we've got the textbook 14 days, but actually there's quite a recent study which showed, I think, like only 17% of females will actually ovulate on that 14th day. Lots of females won't actually ovulate at all. And it's really hard to know for definite. There's a few different methods. Classically, a lot of papers have done like a calendar-based method. So that's when females who will document their own cycle, there'll be a guesstimate of, okay, well, my previous 3 cycles were all 32 days. So we're going to sort of guess when the phases were.
And there's a lot of problems with
there's a lot of problems with that. You can do temperature, so typically your basal body temperature will rise like around ovulation. You can pee on a stick to see if you've ovulated. The gold standard is blood samples, intravenous blood samples. Obviously that's not so easy to just do. A lot of universities or wherever the research centre is, they don't have the facilities to do it. And if you look at a lot of the old research, few papers use that method, so it's hard to say with complete certainty, if any, this is the phase we're trying to test and this is the phase the athletes or individuals are in. So then it's hard to make conclusions based of that.
And I guess it's really difficult to research it as well, because first of all, it's very invasive and it's also really time consuming for you as a researcher and as a participant as well to adhere to that, because also, as you said, we can we can test. No, we're not doing that. We can test. I'm not gonna cut it out. I will leave it in. So we can test like one menstrual cycle, but it's going to differ like every single month. So even if we manage to identify different phases within that one cycle, it might be different in the next one and the next one. So kind of very accurately identifying each phase is just, I don't want to say impossible, but it's very
hard.
difficult.
There was a study I was going to take part in as a participant about a year ago and then couldn't because of injury, but it was menstrual cycle related, and it had something like 30 plus lab visits. Ooh. Which is mental. I think it's, like you said, hard enough for the researcher, but at least that's their job. It's so hard to get participants to come in, and such a large part of research, and I don't know if people outside of research know this, you're just limited by what's actually physically practical and feasible. And you might have this amazing, really robust study that you've planned. Yeah. But if you can't get participants to come and do it, then it's not going to happen. Yeah.
And it's also, you may be able to get them, but then it's the elimination criteria that you've got, because if they are not in that phase when you want to test them or whatever, or you find something that kind of disqualifies them, so to say, then you're losing it.
Yeah,
and that contributes to, again, low quality.
Like ovulation, so I've read so many papers where they start off with like 30 participants or fewer, and then they test them. The participants go through all the testing, and then they validate the menstrual cycle phase, and it turns out also they've not actually ovulated, so they get ruled out. And I think there's two maybe things to note with that, and this is something I'm quite like aware of in my research, that we really struggle as researchers to be able to, you know, do the gold standard level of hormonal like validation. And then when we think about what are we then going to relay to the actual individuals who are possibly going to change their training or whatever they're doing, their sport performance, they're going to have no idea what phase they're in for definite. Yeah. So don't get me wrong, I think it's really important that research is done, but it's actually like, okay, but what if we discover this? How is an athlete going to know, like, oh yeah, I'm definitely on day 3 of the neutral phase?
Yeah, you're not going to go through your life doing like ovulation test
like, blood sample and just like go to my GP this morning to get it tested. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, every like 10 days or something. Yeah.
And then there's also like another layer to it. And there's not going to be, I think, enough time in this podcast. Yeah. But I think it's a recent paper found that only, I think, 50% of the population studied, which was a pretty substantial amount, actually have regular menstrual cycles. A lot of athletes also are on some kind of hormonal contraceptive, which is just a whole other kettle of fish. Yeah. Also under researched. Yeah. And then within those who aren't on any kind of contraceptive, they might have menstrual irregularities. And we were speaking before as well, in the athletic population, there's a high proportion of females with menstrual irregularities in the normal population. And that's also something to consider. There's just there's a lot out there. Yeah, so now we kind of gave a brief overview of why there's not much research out there. Like, it's just very, very like challenging. It's very challenging, and I think where we're at now, which is definitely a direction that I want to take my PhD, is the lived experiences. And also at this point, I think it'll continue to be this, because the research that's out there, which is high quality, is still really conflicting. You'll have studies which show better strength performance or better aerobic performance in a certain phase, and then others which show the complete opposite. There's also some studies looking at nutrition. But at the end of the day, the conclusion is always it's individual, which is great. And like we said, that's not what we want the main theme of this podcast to be. But it is individual, so we think that what can we do with that? And so to me, it's about talking about the lived experiences and actually the monitoring side of it. Do athletes actually even track their own cycle? And we're just talking here about like a diary or an app that they use, as opposed to, again, taking blood samples or saliva samples every day. And then what do they do with that information? Because we just don't really know. Yeah. So when you're talking about the lived experiences, how is there any research out there that you found about, like, whether that's general population or athletes, about their perception of their own menstrual cycle, whether they are tracking or not? Is there something that they experience? Can they identify, or, for example, if I'm menstruating, then there's like a difference in performance? Is there anything out there that you think we can identify? There's not really much on monitoring itself. There's a little bit in terms of around the conversation around the menstrual cycle. There's a paper I was reading this morning, which was a more qualitative study. So talking about like interviews, focus groups with athletes in elite level football, and about the conversations that are had there with coaches, parents, like the whole multidisciplinary team. So talking physiotherapists, nutritionists, and actually there were quite a few themes that emerged from it. One of them is just the general like taboo nature of talking about it and knowing how to go about it. And then also from that, if they do talk about it, is anything done with the information? So if there's, and again, this is so reliant as well on the level that you play. So the higher level you play, you're more likely to have an entire team around you. So many athletes, though, especially if you talk about female sport, don't have the resources to have an abundance of staff members. But let's say you're, you know, like this case, for instance, it's a football team. They have like check boxes every morning where they say like how they're feeling, how they slept, and there'll be a box of like to do with the menstrual cycle. What kind of came from that is that nothing's then done with it. So it's like, okay, great, you're on second day of bleeding, but you're not going to change anything. And there were a couple of athletes that were quoted in this who actually there was a change, that they would talk to their coach about it, and depending on what they were doing. So let's say they were doing some gym-based work, some strength training, they'd adapt the load to suit them, which I think where we're at now anyway, that's sort of the solution, if you will, is talking about it, but then making those changes, making individuals feel comfortable in talking about it, not feeling like if they say, I'm feeling a bit rubbish today, whether that's because of a physical symptom like cramps or bloating, or a psychological symptom, whether that's anxiety around the training, which throws them off. If it's a more skill-based session that they're having, it could impact them in that way. And I think it's being able to say, actually, this is what I'm struggling with, and not feeling like it's an excuse or a cop-out. And I think, so I'm not a coach, you are. So I think it's also, I forgot what I was going to say, it just got out of my head. It's just, I think when you're coaching an athlete, it's so important to monitor like how that you don't need to be going 100% the whole time, and it's important to change the training or the intensity based off how you feel, and because you've got to, you know, lower the intensity because you feel a certain way, that's not only is that not a bad thing, it's going to probably benefit you
100%
in the long run.
Definitely. I think having that kind of awareness and just making people feel comfortable, I think that's the biggest thing. Just what emerged from my kind of research, I looked at a couple of studies, and I don't know if you've seen this particular one, which was elite rugby players. Where they were saying
there are so many of those studies, so they're easy to find.
Literally. So by me saying elite rugby players, you know exactly which study it was. But so they were kind of saying that they don't necessarily have the confidence to go to their coaches about this. And it also emerged that they were more comfortable to speak to female staff members rather than male staff members, which is understandable. And that's why we actually wanted to have one of our male coaches on today. Max was supposed to be here, but he's stuck at Costco at the moment. So unfortunately,
didn't want to talk about the menstrual cycle.
So unfortunately we don't have him today, but I think it's a good idea for male coaches as well to kind of consider this with their athletes and just make them feel like comfortable and
just listen.
Just listening them. Sometimes even that kind of helps and kind of adjust load based on.
And I think like understanding it's a very individual thing. Also, some women will not be impacted at all by it, which is great for them. Very jealous. That's the life I want to lead. How does it feel? Which is fine. I think also, what athletes and individuals have to be careful about is there's information out there. There's some apps on the market which you can use to track your cycle, which give you loads of information. If we think about, even because of social media and different, like I said, apps that are out there, watches, you are just inundated with so much information. We won't make it completely about this. I'll go off on maybe like a little tangent. But you see so many people wearing like the the fitness
Yeah,
watches. I literally wear a Casio, so you can tell I don't wear one. But there's so many individuals who don't know what they're looking for. They get all this data and they don't know what they're looking for, so they have the potential to misinterpret it. They get too focused on it, as opposed to actually just waking up on one day and saying, this is actually how I feel, as opposed to saying, oh, but my watch is telling me this, and my watch said I had a rubbish night of sleep, but I feel actually amazing. And it's really hard to get that balance. And just the less educated you are in that area, it gets hard to be able to critique the information as well. So there's some apps that I've seen which give out so much information with regards to the menstrual cycle. It'll say, in this phase, you're better off doing aerobic training, or you're better off doing more yoga and eating this.
It's a lot of generalization.
And I look at it and I'm like, of course you're now going to feel like you're craving chocolate because you've been told that's what you're going to
psychological, right?
It's so psychological. There's a really interesting study that basically showed, because women are told, like, from the second they can think that you're going to be craving chocolate and certain foods on your period. And there's a really interesting study which basically showed in different areas of the world it's different things, because so much of it is about advertisement and what you're and that's not to say that also you don't have these cravings, but it's really, you've got to be careful in what you actually feel and what is a very strong, like, psychological from just all the information you're consuming. And we just don't know enough currently to say you need to be eating this in this phase and you're going to be feeling weaker now, like see how you feel on the day and go from there. But then on the other side to it as well, I think it's quite hard to I would thoroughly recommend just everyone tracking their own performance. Write down little notes of how you feel and then look for patterns. I think it's hard to get the balance of noticing patterns and then, you know, having things in place to help alleviate potential symptoms, and then also not expecting that to happen and feeling a certain way. It's hard being a woman. It's awful.
Basically.
I'm not surprised they do no research on females.
It's really difficult. But there are some research out there. It's mainly, I would say, like hypotheses. So there are a lot of maybes and ifs and buts. But there are some certain patterns where we can say, you know, performance may be impacted in a certain phase.
I think there's the most recent paper that was looked at all the research, found that it's like maybe like a trivial, so like a really small difference in, I really hope I've got this the right way around, in slightly reduced performance in the early follicular phase. So that's around the period. But then again, that comes with a caveat. A lot of the research is low quality. And again, with that, like, you might be listening, if you're a female listening, and think, oh yeah, I really relate to that. But you also might be thinking, oh, I don't at all. Some, like we said, some women or anyone who menstruates might like get severe symptoms during their period. Things like really heavy bleeding as well is going to impact you.
Of course.
There's a lot of chat, and I think actually the rules have recently been changed about the England team wearing white shorts. Because that's really? So that's really, really recent. I think they've actually been changed to navy, purely because of the stress around, if you're on your period and you're wearing white shorts, especially if you're like then going to compete, which is such as much a mental game as it is a physical game, and you're in the back of your head worrying about like, oh, am I bleeding through? That's just another thing to add to it.
I had no idea. Sorry, when you're talking about performance, you said you looked at this paper. What do we mean by performance?
That is a great question. So,
sorry.
A lot of the research that I have read that has been done looks more at aerobic performance. There's a few papers looking at specific strength outcomes. But again, it's one of those things that's just quite hard, because you're doing these studies in a lab and then in the real world, athletes or in the field, which all again makes a difference when it comes to research, that if you have an individual coming in, they know they're going in for research, and that also mentally might make them feel different. And it's just so hard to know for definite, basically. So for me, I think, like I said, at this point, it's about individuals tracking their own cycle, looking for patterns, and having things in place. And it's nothing necessarily huge. It's things like speaking to your coach and letting them know how you feel, potentially reducing the load. If you have the luxury of having a sports psychologist, definitely utilize them. Things like, I mean, I know just with me personally, and I don't like to make research about me because I'm just one person, but I know in like the week 10 days leading up to my period, I will just generally get a lot more stiff. My joints will hurt a lot more. So if it's things like that, I will then just time massages potentially that I get around them, or have an extra one around them, because I know that will help.
That's really interesting, actually, that you managed to kind of like see a pattern there. Yeah,
so this is kind of what I was talking about with the whole balancing act, because I, for many months, if not a couple of years, sort of ignored patterns, because I was like, no, but if I tell myself I'm going to be feeling really like anxious in the week before my period, then obviously I'm going to. And it took me a while to actually acknowledge, no, there's definitely patterns there. Why don't you actually acknowledge them? And that means you can put something in place. And that has done wonders, because then I'll go into a session, feel really anxious, really off. The first thing for me that'll go is snatches, because they're really technical. But now I'm aware of it, I'm like, that's fine, I'm going to lower the weight, make it a bit easier, just get through the session. And then every single time, the next time I'm in, it goes a lot better. And it's the same, I think, with all athletic performance. It's just understanding how you're feeling.
And I think it's really difficult, because there's this narrative that you're just being weak, you're just finding excuses and whatnot. You just have to push through it. No matter how uncomfortable you feel, especially in your period. And I think that's kind of, even with this podcast, is something that we want to kind of dismantle and whatnot.
There was the paper that I mentioned earlier with the football club. A couple of the comments also were concerns that if they said this is either how I'm feeling or I'm on my period, the coach then wouldn't pick them for the team. Which is like a very real concern. And I also think a lot of that just comes from not good enough education for both athletes and coaches, the whole team working with them. And I think links quite nicely to what I was saying about it's about having solutions in place and not just ignoring it. And we know the S&C industry is dominated, just the whole sports industry is dominated by men. And as much as that does need to be addressed and we need to question why, it's also about working with male coaches, finding out what they think they're missing and give them the education to speak to athletes about it.
I actually found a really good paper on that. I don't know if you've seen that one, where it was kind of like a research with Australian S&C coaches, male coaches.
That's like one of the three.
That's number 2 now. So they were asked what are the exact things that they would like to know about the menstrual cycle. And I think it's good to see that people are open and people want to facilitate these conversations, and there's no awkwardness around it. So
like, I think also, like, it's important, I think, and I keep mentioning this, the two most, for me, in my eyes, the most important things are the conversation around it and then the individual nature of tracking it, because I think we also have to be careful to not overemphasize the impact it may or may not have. For me, it's more about including the menstrual cycle the same way that you'd include how well you slept or how good your nutrition is. Like we mentioned earlier, that there is a bit of research which says, and I can't remember which way around it is off the top of my head, but in a certain phase, your body will utilize fat more than carbohydrate, and the other way around. But I'm pretty sure also in that study, they showed that actually if the athletes had a high carbohydrate diet, there were no performance differences. So it's sort of like, yes, acknowledge the menstrual cycle phase, but don't just sort of throw everything out the window and say, well, this is the phase I'm in, so this is going to have an impact. It's like, actually make sure your nutrition is dialed in. Like, there's so many factors involved. It's just another one of those to be aware of. And hopefully we'll get to some point in society, maybe in centuries to come, where it is just spoken about like another sort of metric to measure. And a lot of that is opening up the conversation.
Definitely.
Around it.
I want to backtrack a little bit though, because you mentioned you feeling a little bit more stiff like 10 days before your period. Is that correct?
So like the week to 10 days beforehand. So often when it's like PMS, premenstrual symptoms.
I found that really interesting, because there's a lot of research out there about joint laxity and ACL injuries and how how it's impacted by the menstrual cycle, especially estrogen. So there are quite a lot of systematic reviews on this now, where they say that, let me just quickly look at my notes, that there's increased laxity during ovulation, and in the late follicular phase, and that can lead to a higher risk for ACL injuries, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
kind of links to
is really, I think a lot
saying.
of that research came from the fact that ACL injuries, they're more prevalent in females than males. And then it's sort of like, oh, is that impacted by the hormones? Then if the hormones are higher in a certain phase. But also with that, again, this is just a comment from one paper from like 2 coaches. But again, we just don't know enough. The studies on high quality to say for definite it's because of the menstrual cycle, as opposed to actually it's just the level of training the athlete has. And again, I think you can't separate all the different sort of reasons. And I think often a lot of sport research has like separated out the disciplines, which I think what's changing a little bit, and definitely with my PhD and my research, I think it's so important to have like a multifactorial approach, multidisciplinary approach, because you can't, everything's just so intertwined. It comes with like females being in sport, they're definitely a lot more involved than they used to be, but because they're just kind of going into it, they are possibly more prone to injury generally. And I hate saying this, but we just don't know enough to know for definite. And also it's something that like hopefully future research will be able to do it more easily. But it might always be the case. So it's a case of monitoring your own cycle, looking for patterns, talking about it, like whether that's to friends, fellow athletes, definitely your coach. And I also think, like, I know, and you're probably the same, I find it very easy to talk about. I definitely talk about it too much. Whereas a lot of people find it a lot harder. And I think those people who find it a bit harder, you don't have to go around shouting about it and like waving tampons in the air.
Like Avital does.
Like I do. I'm like, just let you know, guys, I'm going to go change your tampon.
Trot across MSC to the toilet, like waving it around.
It's just a note on that though. I was so happy when I got to MSC, because I only joined in like July, and saw they had tampons in the female toilets, because oftentimes you're caught off guard, and it's just nice to know that that's there. And it's really small things like that as well. It doesn't need to be this huge dramatic change. Again, I'm not expecting, it would be nice, but I'm not expecting MSC to get like, you know, a flag of a bloody tampon up there.
It would be a bit excessive. I mean, we're facilitating conversations, and
but it's small
open,
things. And like definitely when it comes to, I don't do the classes, but you know, talking either on an individual basis with your coach, or someone who you're in a class with, or the coach of the class. So like, let's say for instance you're doing a class, and as a coach, and you can chime in with this, you're obviously gonna push the members to like a certain level when they're working. And actually it's quite important that like for you to know if there's any like background information. So actually that day maybe don't push them as hard as you usually would. And it's making people feel comfortable to say something to you.
It's interesting now that you speak about this. The members know I usually ask before my class, are there any injuries, aches or pains or anything? But I limited to that. Injuries, aches, pains. I didn't like necessarily address, oh, is anyone on their period right now?
It's really tricky, because like if you got someone like me in the class, I'd be like, guys, you're quiet, I just want to describe to you in detail what's going on. But a lot of other people actually would feel uncomfortable. Even actually like a little anecdote, not sport related. I was back in Manchester, where I'm from, the other week, and my mum had picked me up from the station and drove me home because I'm a little princess. And she also had picked up a friend who she'd just seen in town as well. And she was driving us all back, and she said to me in the car, she was like, oh, is there anything that you need picking up from the shops? And in my head, and this is even me, who my mum also knows that my PhD is about the menstrual cycle. Like, she has learned a lot about it. She's like, this is so cool. She'll go and talk to her friends about it, which is amazing. But even then in my head, because my mum's friend was there, also like a mother, in my head I was like, oh God, like the only thing I need is tampons because I've come on my period. But I feel a bit awkward saying it. And then this all happened in like a split second. I was just like, that's ridiculous. My mum's then gonna get home and I'll be like, oh, actually I need a tampon. And she's gonna be like, well, why didn't you say anything? So I said, yeah, I need tampons. And then her friend just laughed and they were both just like, well, you didn't have to say that. I was like, what have you wanted me to do? And it's like, it's really hard because it's that like response that you get, or people laugh about it, and then you're not going to then say it again. You're like, okay, well, next time.
And if you have one experience like that, that can like literally shut you down for a very long time.
Like what I like doing, and because I'm really confident with it, it's also obviously my career currently, is that when you get met with like an awkward response, and at the end of the day, I understand why a lot of people respond like that, and it's the way they've been raised. So instead of turning around and being like, get over yourself, like
being all sassy,
I'm like, explain to them actually why it's an important conversation to have, and how it impacts you. Because I've had awkward conversations with family members, like uncles who have wives and daughters who are so uncomfortable about it, and I'm like, you have daughters, this is so important to speak about. We've gone on a bit of a tangent, like non-sport specific, but I think at the end of the day though, athletes are people first, which is why it's so important to have the conversation around it.
I do have one more question though before we wrap up. Hormonal contraception.
I was gonna say, we've not even gotten to anything that's outside of
I know
regularly.
I think I need to get you back for a part 2, because
I can do like a little summary. So like for those listening who aren't so familiar, a hormonal contraceptive will cover anything from, God, my mind's just gone completely blank. Either the pill, so that can be combined, or progesterone only, the injection, there's like quite a few different ones. And the same with most things related to females, they will impact females differently. Not only will they impact females differently from individual to individual, a female might, let's say, go on some combined pill, be fine for a few years, and then suddenly her body will choose to react differently, because that's just being a female for you. So yeah, again, we don't know necessarily how that, we just don't know how it impacts performance. But again, it'll potentially come with symptoms as well. And also actually what hormonal contraceptive can do is mask any issues with athletes. So I think we touched briefly like menstrual irregularities. And I mentioned before we started recording the female athlete triad and REDS, which stands for relative energy deficiency, which is in men and women, as opposed to the female athlete triad, which, as it suggests, is female specific. And that's generally a combination of underfueling and overtraining. And in females, actually, fortunately, have this great thing where their menstrual cycle is a sign of optimal health. And the second your cycle stops, that is like your first red flag for something is not right with my body. And oftentimes, if you're on some kind of hormonal contraceptive and you don't have a normal regular menstrual cycle, it's going to mask that, and you're just not going to know. So that's, I guess, a benefit of the menstrual cycle, in that if you've got it, it's healthy.
Sorry. No, I was just going to ask, do you think that there are potential benefits to being on the pill if you are an elite athlete?
I'm gonna say it's individual. It's gonna be individual. I think you can't ignore the factors that are unrelated to sport performance. So things like, because like I said, athletes are people. So things like around fertility, if they want to be on some kind of contraceptive for other reasons. But I think it's a really personal choice, and whatever works for you. We don't know even like the long-term effects of being on hormonal, like generally in like society, because they've not been around for long enough. can I just side note with a really fun fact?
Yes,
which
please.
has nothing to do with sport performance.
Go on.
So one of the women who pioneered in creating the like first hormonal contraceptive, Mary Stopes, I think she's called. So like obviously amazing. It was huge for like revolution, like for women and feminism. So like love her, great for that. She actually was really into eugenics, and she basically wanted people to go on some form of contraception. So she didn't want certain people basically to reproduce and have babies if they had like any, in her eyes, like deficiencies.
Wow.
So that was where contraception, hormonal contraception comes from.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, anyway, little side note.
Wow.
But yeah, I think with that, it's a really personal choice.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, we don't know enough about the long-term effects. I think there's a lot of benefits to not being on contraceptives. But then again, if you have an athlete who has like super heavy bleeding and really bad, you know, menstrual cycle related disorders, the PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is kind of like PMS on steroids, so I describe it, which impacts your day-to-day life. Actually, you're probably potentially better off going on some kind of contraceptive. But there's a lot of there's just a lot of things to weigh up. And again, I think it's an important conversation to have with your coach, especially if you are an athlete, either who's at a really elite level and their career to a degree is reliant on it, or even if you're just recreationally active, but your performance is really important to you and it's potentially going to affect your training and performance. Talk to a coach about it, talk to a GP about it, just get a you know, balanced view of opinions. Because we just don't know enough. So getting one person's opinion isn't always enough.
Course. Yeah, you need to be well educated to make such a decision. 100%. You actually touched on that like briefly. That reminded me of something where you said there's a difference between kind of recreational athletes and elite level athletes. So I think it's interesting when we look at the research where the differences, the performance differences that we're finding at the moment is so, I don't want to say it's probably significant, but statistically it's insignificant, which is probably not really impacting someone who's just a regular gym goer or just a recreational athlete. However, if someone is on an athlete level, that like marginal difference can make like first or second place.
Like, it works both ways, like definitely everything you've just said, but so often in research, if you look at like ergogenic aids, for instance, oftentimes research is done on recreational athletes because they are the easiest to get a hold of. But then those results won't necessarily translate, and you can't generalize to elite level athletes because they're at such a high level, the adaptation is going to be minimal. But it's interesting having sort of the reverse, that at an elite level, it's potentially going to be more important having that slight tiny difference. But also I think when it comes to talking about solutions or how the menstrual cycle is managed, for me, I think it's just as important from the recreational level up until the elite level. And I think it's such a broad topic, but when we think about women in sport and women being active, because we see sort of around puberty, females and young girls getting engaged in sport really drops off. And so much of that is just so connected to puberty when the menstrual cycle starts, the conversation around it, young girls feeling uncomfortable.
It is a barrier.
It's a mammoth topic.
It's definitely a barrier to participation. And it started at that age. 100%.
Which is hopefully, and I won't go into this loads, but with my PhD, I'm going to combine like different disciplines when it comes to the research, because like I said earlier, I think it's just there's so many factors that play a role. And I think often a lot of sport specific like performance research will focus on a physical difference, but maybe neglect to acknowledge that the psychological impact will then impact physical, potentially will impact the physical performance, and you just can't ignore all the underlying factors. So we've got a long way to go, but on the bright side, I can kind of get a career out of it. So hopefully we won't fix things too soon.
Yeah. Well, definitely keep us updated on how your research is going. I think we're gonna wrap that up here. Thank you so much for coming on today.
No worries. I love chatting about it. So if anyone wants to come and ask me a question,
if you guys see Avital on the gym floor, please approach her.
Preferably not mid-training. I might cry on you. If I'm having a bad week of snatches, I will cry on you.
Yeah, just beware. Pick your moment. But yeah, anyway, thank you so much for coming on here. And I'll speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.